Who owns Arunachal Pradesh? Who controls Arunachal Pradesh? Who does Arunachal Pradesh actually belong to? India or China? In the last episode, part 1, which is tagged at the end of this video, we traced a conflict back to its origin, not to armies, not to diplomacy, but to a map. In the Western Himalayas, that map turned Aksai Chin into a strategic question. A place no one lived in suddenly mattered to both India and China. But the story doesn't end there, because in the east, the terrain changes, and so does the nature of the problem, that is, between India and China. Here, it is not just empty land. It is a dense stretch of foothills, active trade routes, and something far less expected: authority rooted not in a state, but in a monastic order. Before sovereignty was enforced by armies, there was a moment, brief but decisive, when the fate of this frontier rested in the hands of monks. This is the Eastern theater, not of barren isolation, but of monasteries, trade, and competing claims of authority. This is the story of the McMahon Line and the monks who once agreed to it. To understand how this all began, we step back, not decades, but more than a century. North of the Himalayas, on the other side, towards China, in the east lies Tibet, the highest plateau on earth, cold, sparse, and self-contained. To the south, the terrain shifts sharply into the humid foothills of Assam and parts of what is today Arunachal Pradesh. For centuries, these regions were not divided by a fixed boundary. They were separated by conditions of life. Tibetan political authority was concentrated on the plateau. It extended through monasteries, networks of lamas, and systems of spiritual influence. It was not organized around clearly demarcated borders. It did not need to be. As a result, contact between Tibet and the greener tropical regions to the south remained quite limited. Between them stood a band of Himalayas nearly 100 miles wide, a natural separation. And where interaction is minimal, friction rarely emerges. There was, however, one core exception: a narrow corridor through the mountains, a trade route connecting India and Tibet, which today sits right next to the eastern border of Bhutan. And at its center sat Tawang, a major monastery, and a modest but important source of revenue as well. For the monks, this mattered, not as territory in the modern sense, but as a functional node, a place that sustained the institution. Beyond that, to the east, vast stretches of high terrain held little practical value. The monks did not reject the idea of boundaries. They simply operated in a world where boundaries were not the primary organizing principle. Later, at the turn of the 20th century, a different logic entered the region. The British Empire required clarity because beyond Tibet, the British feared that the Russian Empire was advancing. This was the strategic environment of the Great Game. For the British, undefined frontiers were not neutral. They were vulnerabilities. So, in 1907, Britain and Russia agreed to keep Tibet as a buffer. China, internally strained and politically weakened, was positioned as the intermediary. For the British, this was not incidental. A weak China was a manageable presence, useful in form, but unlikely to challenge the arrangement in substance. By 1913-1914, the situation had shifted. China was now in political turmoil. Tibet functioned with de facto independence, a condition that it, in practice, endured for nearly the following 4 decades until 1950. So, the British convened negotiations in 1914, the Shimla Convention. 3 parties attended: Britain, China, and Tibet. In practice, it was Britain and Tibetan monks who moved the discussions forward. At Shimla, a boundary was drawn, the McMahon Line. It shifted the frontier northward into largely uninhabited terrain, and it placed Tawang on the British side. Tibet signed the agreement. The Chinese just initialed it. Why? Because for the Tibetans, most of that terrain held limited practical meaning. What mattered was preserving the functioning core of their monastic order, maintaining stability along the line, along the frontier with a far more powerful British Empire, and crucially, securing a degree of recognition from the dominant power of the time, that is the British. China's position was different. Its representatives initialed the agreement, but under conditions of weakness and constraint. The state was internally fractured, geographically distant from the negotiations, and quite honestly not in a position to assert or enforce an alternative. For a time, this contradiction remained contained. The British were absorbed in global conflict, World War I. The region remained quiet, and the maps receded into the background. In 1947, India became independent and inherited the boundary as its own. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party came to power and moved to assert control over Tibet. The newly established People's Republic of China approached the inherited boundary with a very different framework. To Beijing, Tibet was not a sovereign actor. It was a territory. And the monks? They were not legitimate representatives of the state. They were a theocratic authority outside the structure of modern centralized communist system. So China rejected the agreement. Not only the boundary itself, but the very premise on which it rested. The maps had been accepted by the monks. China rejected the idea that monks could speak for a nation. And more fundamentally, a system of authority rooted in monasteries was incompatible with the state China was now becoming. The monks were not just negotiators of the past, they were an order that would not continue into the future. The authority of the monks was dismantled, and with that, the basis of the earlier agreement collapsed. An arrangement accepted by monks held no legitimacy for a modern state. A quiet ambiguity became an active dispute. So what's the crux? Once again, the terrain is not the central issue. Authority is. In the West, across Aksai Chin, the British produced multiple boundary alignments, each shaped by shifting strategic considerations. In the East, across Tawang and the foothills of Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, they relied on the agreements with the Tibetan monastic order, those who ruled Tibet at the time. Later states inherited those decisions, but not the assumptions behind them. India accepted the inherited boundary, the McMahon Line. China rejected both the boundary and the authority that had validated it. So here's a perspective. The Himalayas were not historically front lines. They were a natural buffer between different worlds. That function was altered, not by geography, but by interpretations and the changing international and domestic politics both within India and China. That is the deeper story of the McMahon Line and the monks who once stood behind it. In part 3, we bring these threads together and examine how these inherited boundaries collided after independence and why the conflict still endures. Ideas shape societies long before events do. If this reflection gave you something to think about, pass it on to someone who values meaning, not just information. And subscribe to continue the conversation. Until next time.